Hey guys, Will here. So in the previous video, we took a look at the GSI X29, and today we're going to be taking a look at its two bigger brothers, the Formula Pro Elite V2 and the Hyper P1. Now these are some of the more expensive sim racing wheels available on the market, but a bit of a spoiler alert here, these are two of the nicest sim racing wheels that I've personally ever tested, and I've tested a lot of sim racing wheels, as you guys would know by now. So what we're going to be doing in today's video is talking through some of the differences between the two of these, because I'm sure a lot of you are wondering which one might be most suitable for you, as well as comparing these to a lot of other wheels that you'll find at a similar kind of point within the market too. So by the end of today's video, you should have a much better understanding of whether one of these two or something else is going to be the best choice for your sim rig. So let's dive in and check out these wheels. Okay, so as always, firstly, a couple of quick housekeeping things just to have the full context of exactly what's going on today. So firstly, big thank you to GSI for sending across both of these wheels and the X29 that we looked at in the previous video to check out. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, we will be cross-comparing these wheels against a whole bunch of other options from other manufacturers in today's video. So it is important that you guys are aware that all of the wheels that we're talking about today were all sent to us under the exact same conditions. If you do decide you want to pick up either of these wheels, any of the other wheels we talk about, or any other sim racing gear for that matter, head over to boostedmedia.net or jump down in the description box below. There you will find a whole bunch of discount codes and affiliate links. Those are an absolutely awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media if you find what we do here valuable, and saving yourselves a little bit of cash in the process as well. So really do appreciate your support there. But as is always the case here at Boosted Media, nobody, including GSI, has any sort of say in anything that we're talking about in today's video. Purely just sharing my own observations and my own opinions, having used these wheels for quite some time now. So without further ado, let's dive in and check out the Hyper P1 and the Formula Pro Elite V2. All right, so we may as well get this out of the way right from the start here. You might want to be sitting down for this because these wheels are very expensive. So the big daddy here, the Hyper P1, comes in at a starting price of $1,650 US, and that is before you factor in any taxes, shipping costs, import duties, or anything like that. Now we do have a 5% discount code available for GSI, link down in the description below or over on boostedmedia.net. So it might sound like a small percentage, but that is actually quite a significant saving when you're spending this kind of money on a wheel. So factor that into your equations as well. But yeah, look, I did mention starting price there. This guy can be spec'd north of $2,000 US if you want to go for the 6-paddle option like what you have here with the carbon fiber accents, and if you want to go into a full custom build with different buttons, different colors, and so forth as well. Now they have a really cool configuration tool on their website. I'll put some shots on the screen for you now. Allows you to customize all sorts of different elements on the wheel to really fine tune things. And that's a really nice way of customizing both of these wheels to match exactly what you want out of the wheel. So look, I mean, by no means is that necessary. It's not actually going to change the user experience, but you know, if you want to have something that's fully customized to exactly the way you want it, then that is an option for you as well. And I must say that the way they've integrated that custom wheel tool on their website now compared to when we reviewed the original Formula Pro Elite a couple of years ago now, they have made some very, very significant improvements since that time. So yeah, definitely worth just checking out. You don't have to pay for a wheel to check that tool out. You can jump on the website now and check it out for yourselves as you're watching the video if you want to, in fact. So as I was mentioning, on top of the customization that's available for the front panel, you have the option of 4 paddles in aluminium or carbon fiber. Carbon fiber is a little bit more expensive. Now with the 4 paddle option, you get the 2 shifters plus the analog clutches included. So if you go for the 6 paddle option, that is adding the 2 digital switches at the top, not the clutch paddles. Just wanted to make sure that was absolutely clear. And again, you have the option of aluminium or carbon fiber here. Look, it doesn't make any functional difference to the wheel. The weight difference is, you know, completely negligible, and it's no more rigid with one option over the other either. So the driver experience is literally identical. It's purely just an aesthetic, personal preference, and completely up to you guys. I'm not going to tell you that one is better than the other because they are pretty much exactly the same. Now you do have a couple of different options here for mount spaces and things like that too. We'll cover that a little bit later on when we take a look at the back of the wheel. So switching focus over to the FPE V2 now, and look, I'll be completely honest with you guys, I actually prefer this wheel over the Hyper P1, even though it is a little bit cheaper and doesn't have quite the same functionality that we get with the Hyper P1, simply because it's a little bit more versatile in terms of driving styles. The Hyper P1 is a little bit more focused towards that sort of more prototype style driving. You're gripping the wheel a little bit lower down, whereas this is a little bit more versatile, at least in my opinion, but you may feel differently about it. In terms of functionality differences here, you don't have the option of the 2 top paddles, so you do only have either a 2 or a 4 paddle configuration option here available. Other than that, you may also, if you've got a keen eye, notice that we have 2 additional thumb encoders on the Hyper P1, as well as a 7-way multi-position switch down the bottom here that we don't get on the FPE V2. So just to be completely clear here, starting price does only come with the 2 shifter paddles. You don't get the analog clutches included. If you do want to go up to the option of the analog clutches with the aluminium paddles, you're looking at $1,437 US. So still $200 less than what you're paying for the P1 or thereabouts with the same paddle configuration. And then if you go up to the carbon fiber option, which again isn't a necessary upgrade unless you just like the aesthetic, you're looking at $1,487 US. And if you want to go for the custom option, like what we were talking about with the Hyper P1 before, that does bump the price up again to $1,662 US. And there are a couple of other additional accessories, like we mentioned before, with hubs and spacers and things like that, which will add additional cost as well. So in the end there, the spec as you see it here for the Hyper P1 comes in at $1,910 US, and the Formula Pro Elite V2 that we have here would come in at $1,487. So quite a significant difference between the two. And again, just remember that discount code that we did mention before, linked down in the description below. Now, it is just worth quickly mentioning here that if you are after a wheel that is ergonomically pretty much exactly the same as these, but doesn't have an LCD screen, they do have you covered there as well. So there is the Hyper SL, which is essentially the same wheel as this, but without the screen. And that guy comes in at a starting price of $1,299 US. Then there's a GXL V2, which is again ergonomically pretty much identical to the FPE V2, but without the screen. And that guy comes in at a starting price of $875 US. So definitely worth checking those out. Again, I mean, I haven't had hands-on with them specifically, but assuming that they are pretty much identical ergonomically to this, which they certainly look to be, then yeah, if you're after a wheel that doesn't have an LCD screen, those I would imagine would be awesome options. So just check out other reviews for those two. I'm sure there'll be somebody out there that has reviewed those and can give you a better picture of exactly what those are like. So where does this place it in comparison with some of the other wheels that we've tested recently here on the channel? So some of the options that I'm sure people would be interested in, firstly, the McLaren Artura wheel from Asher Racing. Now, unfortunately, I don't have that wheel here at the moment. When I picked up the 5090 from Optimum Tech, I loaned him that wheel. So hopefully we'll get it back soon. But we do have some shots from some of our other review videos here. And I can tell you that the build quality here is pretty similar overall. The Asher Racing wheels may be a little bit cleaner in its design overall. It doesn't have quite as much going on in terms of general busyness on the wheel. But look, in terms of the overall functionality, quite similar in the user experience. And again, we do have full detailed reviews of all these wheels that I'll be mentioning. So I'm not going to get too bogged down in all the details now, but just to give you an idea, something like that is going to set you back in euro, because that's the native pricing on their website, 1,449 euro, but that does include 19% VAT depending on where you are in the world. So it is going to come in significantly cheaper than the Hyper P1 and a similar kind of price bracket to what we're looking at with the FPE V2. We then have something like the CSX3 from Cube Controls. And overall, this is a somewhat similar user experience. The switchgear on this wheel, both rotary encoders and push buttons, are quite similar. I would say the GSI wheels have a very slight edge over this, but probably not enough to justify the difference in cost. Look, in terms of the overall build quality here, I would say GSI does have a slight upper hand as well, just because of little things like, you know, plastic shrouds on the top paddles as opposed to full aluminium construction here. We do have a little bit more adjustability in the paddles on this wheel, but again, you can check out the full review for all the details on that. I'm just not a big fan of all the kind of plastic shrouds and things that are going on the Cube Controls wheel. I just find it makes it look a little bit cheap in comparison to the GSI, but that is pretty subjective. Look, in terms of objective differences here, the overall driving experience is very similar between the two. Functionality is very similar as well. The main difference being that this is a smaller diameter than what you're getting with either of these wheels. So I actually prefer the diameter of both of these guys. We'll get into the details on that in just a moment. A CSX3, for comparison, you're looking at 1,335 euro with free shipping. So again, again, similar kind of price bracket to what we're looking at with the Formula Pro Elite V2 and quite a bit cheaper than what we're looking at with the Hyper P1. And then we get into some of the more quirky wheels. We've got the Solpex Spectra XR, and again, we do have a full review of this on the channel. This is more similar in build quality, aluminium construction pretty much throughout here, and some pretty interesting things that they do with the UI on this wheel. A much bigger screen, and this wheel uses a plugin for SimHub to do some really interesting things with menus and selectable options and whatnot. So I would definitely recommend check this out as another option. I would say that I do prefer the user experience with both of these wheels over this, but only by a very slim margin. And the rest of it is honestly just down to pure subjective preference between the two. Build quality is very similar, switch gear is very similar overall. And yeah, it's a very, very good wheel. So definitely check out the review of that. And then lastly, just to quickly mention, and by no means is this all exhaustive, but this is just some of the wheels that we've reviewed here recently on the channel that came to mind as I was looking at this. So this is the Rexing Myaris V2 wheel. And again, this is quite funky in terms of, you can see it's got 3 additional screens down the bottom here. Gives you a lot of options and things that you can configure through menus on board on the wheel itself. This is also a lot lighter than either of these wheels are, with a full carbon fiber construction all around the back here as well. So check out the full detailed review of that guy as well. But the Solpex Spectra XR comes in at a price of, let me have a look at my list here, €1,499 plus VAT, and the Rexing Myaris V2 comes in at €1,360 plus VAT. Now I know I'm mixing up US dollars and euro here. I generally just prefer to use the native pricing on the manufacturer's website. That way we don't lose any information in translation or exchange rates or anything like that. So at the time that you're watching the video, just make sure that you do check the conversion between those two currencies. But all of those wheels come in at a similar kind of ballpark price figure to the FPE V2, and all quite a lot cheaper than the Hyper P1. So what exactly are you getting for your money here? Let's run through both of these wheels now in some more detail. So both of these wheels have a diameter of 300 millimeters, which sits them right in the sweet spots, in my personal opinion, for versatility. Now, obviously you're not going to be doing rally style driving or drifting or anything like that with a butterfly style wheel like these, but the larger you go with the diameter, the more of a damping effect it has on the force feedback, and the more vague the steering inputs feel in general. Conversely, if you go too far the other way, things start to feel really twitchy and overreactive. If you look at something like the Fanatec Formula style wheels, for example, those are 270 millimeter, and they do feel quite twitchy. You do get used to it, of course. It's certainly by no means a deal breaker for most people, but if you have the option, somewhere between the sort of 290 to 300, maybe 310 millimeter at a maximum, tends to be the sweet spot for most people, at least in my opinion and from the people that I've spoken to. So 300 millimeter diameter sits it right bang in the middle of the sweet spot. Just by reference as well, the X29 that we looked at in the last video is 290 millimeters, so a little bit less diameter than what we have with these guys. So while we're on the subject of diameter, it's also worth mentioning the hand grips on these. Now, if you remember, the original Formula Pro Elite wheel had very, very, very chunky hand grips, which some people were a fan of, some people not so much. If you've got big gorilla hands, then this was an absolutely excellent wheel. But for somebody with more girly hands like I have, it was maybe a little bit too chunky. And again, it is going to come down purely to just subjective preference. But I do find both of these wheels more comfortable to drive with overall than the original FPE wheel was. So that is worth just noting there. So look, they are still relatively chunky by comparison to a lot of other wheels on the market. So if you do want really thin grips, then maybe these aren't the wheels for you. They aren't interchangeable, unfortunately, like they are on some other sim racing wheels. But personally, I do find them very comfortable. Also, very happy to report, just like what we talked about with the X29 wheel, if you saw that the other day, this grip material, while it is still rubberized and it does have a nice squishy feel to it, it doesn't have that sort of tacky, sticky feeling that any of you guys that have been watching my wheel reviews for a while now would know I absolutely hate. I do seem to be a little bit on my own with that one. A lot of people actually like that grip material, but I just find driving with bare hands, you know, it does tend to pick up dead skin cells and debris off your hands, and just feels clammy and gross when your hands start to get sweaty. I don't find this to be any less grippy than those grips are. I know that that's a trade-off that some people aren't willing to make. They prefer to have a grippier feeling, even if it does mean that it kind of feels a little bit slimy when your hands get sweaty. But yeah, this grip material is absolutely spot on. You can see it does still pick up a little bit of debris, but certainly nothing like some of the other wheels that we've tested over over the years, and you know, it feels really nice whether you're wearing gloves or not. So yeah, I would say they've absolutely nailed that, and that is not something that I say very often, even with very, very high-end sim racing wheels. So yeah, really good job there. Again, that is a subjective preference thing, but important to point out there. One thing I did notice, however, is that when I put extended use on these wheels, and it didn't happen immediately, I did find that the grip material did start to rub off on my hands a little bit. I ended up with black stains around the touch point, so around my index finger and thumb, and then a little bit on the palm of my hand where it rubs against the bottom too. Now, in the case of the FPE V2 wheel, which is the one that I put the most usage into, you can actually see it's starting to show a visible sign of wear there. Now, granted, this probably has a good 50 or 60 hours of use in it now. I haven't put the same amount of usage into the X29 or the Hyper P1, simply because I just really love driving with the FPE V2. But yeah, you can see some visible signs of wear and tear on that grip material. And obviously, you know, if it's leaving residue behind on your hands, it's got to be coming from somewhere. So look, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's a major complaint by any means. It's certainly not wearing down or changing the feeling at all, but yeah, just something that I did notice. So I obviously wanted to point that out to you guys so that you are aware. But yeah, look, I mean, that aside, absolutely love this grip material, and it is ergonomically really nice and chunky, really good, comfortable feeling in the hands. Yeah, I can't rate these grips highly enough. I really do love what they've done here. And then we get into the construction and materials here. So we've got 5mm genuine carbon fiber for the faceplate on both wheels. In the case of the Hyper P1, the 5mm thick carbon fiber actually ends at the top and the sides here. And then there's a secondary metal plate that's sort of built into the rear housing here, and that's what the grips are actually molded around. So look, in both cases, absolutely perfectly fine and rigid, no issues with flex or anything like that to speak of. And that is always something that I in particular check on the on these open bottom style wheels, because a few of the ones that we've tested, even on the high end in the past, do have quite a bit of flex in the bottoms of the grip. Absolutely no issue at all to speak of with regards to that with the Hyper P1. So if you want to have something that is super, super rigid, no problems at all with flex in either case there. So while we're still on the subject of ergonomics here, both these wheels are a little bit more towards the heavy side of the market. For the Formula Pro Elite V2, you're looking at 1.43 kilograms for the 2-paddle configuration. That jumps up to 1.53 kilograms if you opt for the clutches. In the case of the Hyper P1, you're looking at 1.68 kilograms with the clutches and shifters, and if you add the top paddles, you're looking at 1.85 kilograms. Now, the significance of weight on a steering wheel is quite simply the more rotating mass you have, the more vague the force feedback's going to feel overall. Look, this sort of segment of the market, I would imagine most people that are looking at a wheel this expensive are probably going to have a pretty high-end wheelbase already, and therefore probably aren't going to be too impacted by a heavier wheel, because you're going to have the torque and the forces there necessary to counteract it. But if you are looking at a wheel that you're going to operate on a weaker wheelbase, so maybe under sort of 10, 12 Newton meters of strength, you may want to look at something a little bit lighter than these wheels are, simply because it is going to have a damping effect on the force feedback and make it a little bit more difficult to change direction quickly and so forth. But in both cases, the wheels are weighted very nicely. They're very well balanced, and yeah, there's no sort of awkwardness or weirdness at all going on in either case. So no complaints there, but yeah, they are a little bit on the heavy side, particularly if you compare to something like the Rexing Myars V2, which is exceedingly light for something that is as feature rich as it is. So if you're after a light wheel, definitely check out the full review of that particular guy. So look, I think that covers everything you need to in lieu of the actual driving experience, which we'll obviously get into later. Let's talk about the actual inputs on the faces of these wheels now. Now, we mentioned before that the only real differences in terms of functionality are the additional thumb encoders that you have on the Hyper P1. You can see we've got 2 thumb encoders, which are in a good position here, nice and convenient on the FPE V2. You've got 2 on either side here, and then 2 up the top here, which are all very easy to reach. And in both cases, you can reach all of these buttons around to about here very easily with your thumb without having to rotate your hand, which means you can make adjustments to all of these, including the 2 thumb encoders, without having to adjust your hand position if you wanted to make an adjustment mid-corner. And that is the case with both wheels, always something that I look for in any high-end sim racing wheel. So on the Hyper P1, we've got 12 RGB backlit buttons. On the Formula Pro Elite V2, we have 10. So these 2 ones here aren't actually buttons. That is one other difference in the functionality between the 2 that I didn't mention before. But yeah, these are just LED little indicator lights here, which are fully configurable. So all the buttons here are fully configurable through SimHub, and I'll take you through some of that detail a little bit later on in today's video. So you can configure these LEDs to react to what's going on track. So track status, for example, if you've got a car next to you, you can make them flash as a spotter. and basically whatever you want to do with them, you can through SimHub. It is fully customizable. The switches themselves have a really nice snappy activation, 500 grams of activation force in both cases, and they do both feel absolutely identical to each other. So look, the button feel is quite similar to what you would find, as I mentioned before, on the Cube Control CSX3. These are maybe a little tiny bit more snappy. Subjectively, I do slightly prefer the feeling of these buttons, but there is very, very, very little, if anything, in between the two. I think unless you were sort of had them both side by side on the table, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. Some other wheels have slightly more squishy buttons, but you know, again, check out our full detailed reviews on all those wheels for all the breakdown of that. But yeah, no complaints at all with regards to the feeling of the buttons. Yeah, they're absolutely fine, nice and snappy, no risk of accidentally pressing without knowing that you've done so. And you can see they do have shrouds around all of these buttons. Although most people that are in a market for a wheel with a screen on it probably aren't going to be racing in VR, it does mean that you can feel where you are on the wheel quite conveniently, even if you're not looking at it, which I guess is useful if you're mid-corner and you want to make an adjustment or something like that too, while you're establishing your muscle memory. And they are metal shrouds around all those as well. There's no plastic, unlike what we see on the Cube Controls wheels for comparison there. Now, one important thing to note with regards to the push buttons, just like what we saw with the X29, is that these aren't stickers that you see. These are actually UV printed buttons. Now, unlike with the X29, which just comes with what it comes with, you do have the option within that configuration tool that we were talking about before to change out what you have displayed on each button here. So look, you can pull the wheels apart, and there are some instructions on the GSI website if you do want to change these button caps out or swap their positions. But the best way to do this would be to configure it when you actually make your custom wheel in the configuration tool, and that way you're going to get the buttons in the positions that you want them. But look, the advantage of these UV printed buttons is that they're nowhere near as impacted by general wear and tear. You've seen a lot of wheels by now, you know, the stickers start to move around or twist or slide after extended use. Quite often the backlight shining through them isn't quite uniform as well. So this just has a much cleaner and more high-end look and feel overall, I would say, than pretty much anything that I've tested before, to be completely honest with you guys. Very, very nice integration here, but of course at the cost of not being able to just easily change and put different stickers on later on if you wish to do so. So yeah, just be mindful of that. We do on the Hyper P1 have 3 of these 7-way switches. Look, 3 may be a little bit excessive here. I can't really think of too many usage cases where you'd need more than 2. I usually say in my review videos 2 is good because you can map one to your for your black box inside the car and the other one to your menu system. I'm sort of scratching my brain trying to think of why I would use a third one, but it's there if you want it. I'm sure you can let me know in the comments down below what you might find that useful for. But we've got rotary encoder functionality as well as left, right, up, down, and push button, and exactly the same on the Formula Pro Elite V2 wheel as well. Nice, clearly defined detents rotating in each direction, and these are identical to the ones on the X29 as well, for those of you who might be sort of tossing up between the two. So yeah, no issues at all operating those with or without gloves. Some wheels can feel a little bit too vague with gloves on, or maybe a little bit too stiff without gloves on. This, I would say, is right in the sweet spot. And same goes for the rotary dials down here as well. We'll take a look at the extended functionality of these when we get into the software a little bit later on. But just so you guys are aware, in both cases here, you can actually engage a second function by pushing down and then rotating the knobs. So you might want to map one, so say traction control 1 would be just rotating it normally, and then traction control cut or traction control 2 might be pushing the same button down and then rotating it, for example. So fully configurable through the software, and we'll take a look at that in just a moment. But these are, of course, metal touch points in both cases and do have very nice solid clicks in either direction. I will say I do prefer the switch style that we have here on the Formula Pro Elite V2. That is one of the little reasons why I subjectively prefer the FPE V2 over the Hyper P1. I just find these a little bit easier to, you know, quickly sort of grab and rotate. And also you can kind of establish muscle memory around the physical feeling and position of these switches. Whereas with this switch style, you can't really sort of feel the position. You've got to kind of look at it to know exactly what's going on. So there is that difference here. You might have noticed as well, the switches do react to when you push the buttons too. So that is all programmable through SimHub, of course, but yeah, you can customize that to your heart's content. Just wanted to quickly show you that because it is quite cool. So then just quickly on the thumb encoders, which we mentioned briefly earlier, again, they've done a really nice job here of getting the feeling of clicks between them absolutely perfect. And I don't use that term lightly, but whether you're driving with gloves on or gloves off, just like what we're talking about with the rotary encoders before, some wheels can be way too stiff to use without gloves and they kind of cut into your fingers. Some wheels like the Fanatec Formula style wheels, for example, a lot of people complain that they find the thumb encoders to be far too loose and you just can't can't feel where you are if you're rotating, particularly with gloves on. So yeah, I would say they've absolutely nailed that. One thing that I will just have a little minor whinge about with regards to the Hyper P1 is that I did notice that the position 1 on these switches does unfortunately correlate with the little hole for the grub screw. So if you're OCD like me and you always like to return your switches to position 1, you are going to unfortunately be looking at the hole for the grub screw all the time. So that is one very, very, very minor little complaint there. I would have preferred it if they printed the numbers aligned a little bit differently, so you're not always looking at that hole if you return it to number 1, but you know, that's just my OCD. But yeah, when you break it down to all the buttons and functions that you have available on both wheels, you've got a total of 57 mappable functions on the FPE V2 and a total of 72 on the Hyper P1. So just to quickly touch on the displays as well, both of these wheels feature a 4.3 inch LCD. Both of them have very good viewing angles. I mean, not that you're ever going to be looking at a steering wheel off center anyway, so it doesn't really matter realistically, but yeah, you can move from side to side and they don't lose their color or ghost or anything weird like that. Nice and vibrant and bright as well, as you can see in the driving footage, so no complaints there whatsoever. And the resolution, I'm not 100% certain exactly what the resolution is. It's not actually listed on their website at all, but I can tell you that it is absolutely sufficient to read even, you know, relatively fine text and things like that if you wanted to look at something like a leaderboard on the display. So yeah, no complaints at all with regards to the LCDs. There are other wheels that have larger displays, as we were mentioning before, the Solpex Spectra XR and the Myaris V2 from Rexing, both do have larger displays. But regardless of whether you're using GSI's SimHub dashes or something like Lovely Dashboard, for example, very, very clear to read, no issues at all. And they are both touchscreen functionality as well, so you can map the touch to changing pages or other functions to your heart's content as well. Now, LEDs, we also do have an array of LEDs on both wheels. We've got an RPM strip across the top in both cases, as well as flag LEDs on either side. So on the Hyper P1, we have a total number of addressable RGB LEDs of 88, whereas on the FPE V2, we have a total number of 66. So again, you can map these and control them however you want through SimHub. There are a lot of LED profiles from guys like Daniel Newman Racing, for example, which are available for these too. So if you're not keen to spend the time to configure your own custom profiles, there is plenty of support there. And they do have a fantastic Discord community too, where a lot of people share their hard work. So yeah, really good to see that. And that has all moved on a very long way since we originally reviewed the Formula Pro Elite a number of years ago. But we'll talk about that more when we get into software in just a moment. So I think that's everything we need to talk about in terms of the front sides of the wheels. Let's flip the wheels around now and quickly talk about shifters and paddles, quick releases, USB cables, and all those important details. Okay, so what do we have on the back of these wheels? Let's start with the FPE V2 here. So look, I mean, in terms of build quality materials, identical between the two once again. We've got the GSI CEMS NS2 shifters here. Now, there isn't any adjustability in terms of throw or activation or anything like that. But look, honestly, I don't think that anybody's going to need it. Some of the wheels that I've tested in the past, like the Cube Controls wheels, for example, in some cases we've found that where they do have a lot of adjustability, things can work their way loose over time and start to move around or just slip out of calibration. Not going to have an issue with a shifter that can't be adjusted. So as long as it's well positioned and you've got nice big paddles like what we do have here, I think that that's probably a good design choice, but you may feel otherwise. Let us know in the comments down below what you think about that. But you can see aluminium cages here, nice and chunky, absolutely no flex or movement or anything like that at all to speak of in any case on any of these paddles. You can see we do have the carbon fiber option here in both cases. If we pull up the X29, this is the aluminium version. No real meaningful difference between the two. There's no more or less flex in either case. The only real difference being if you are driving with bare hands, then the metal is obviously a cold touch point, whereas carbon fiber is generally going to just sort of idle at room temperature a little bit more. But yeah, look, very, very good shifters. Some of the best shifters, if not the best shifters I think I've ever experienced on any wheel. And the reason I say that is, again, because the activation force here, subjectively, of course, is absolutely perfect, at least for me. So the amount of effort that's required to get the shift to initiate is just absolutely spot on. Not too stiff and not too loose either. I do have a habit, if I've got loose shifters, of kind of just idling and holding them a little bit past the threshold, and then sometimes I end up missing shifts. That is just a bad habit that I have. Not everybody's going to do that, but yeah, these shifters are absolutely amazing, and they're relatively quiet as well. You can hear, they're not the quietest I've tested, but they do have little rubber stoppers inside there that do stop them from smacking metal to metal. So certainly not the loudest either. If you compare them to something like Asher Racing, for example, if I reach across quickly here, you can hear much, much, much louder on the Asher Racing wheel. Although if you do kind of hold it in your hand and cushion it yourself, you can make it quiet, but you're not really going to be doing that when you're driving most of the time. So yeah, definitely quieter on the GSI wheels. Now, remembering that the analog clutch pedals are an optional extra on the FPE V2, you can see plenty of movement there. These are mappable as individual axis, so you can use them as a throttle and brake, or as a single axis like a handbrake, which you can activate on either side, or as a dual bite point clutch. And we'll show you how that all works through the software a little bit later on. Now, the upper paddles and the shifters don't have any adjustability, but the clutch paddles do actually have an adjustment for the amount of throw. So you can loosen the little 2mm bolt on either side of this rear part of the cage here, and this will then pivot in and out to allow you to adjust the amount of throw. Now, unfortunately, they don't include an Allen key to get in there, and my Allen key, or all the Allen keys that I have, are actually too fat to fit in that gap there, which I think probably most people are gonna find to be the case, because this is already a pretty shallow Allen key. So I would like to see them, include a 15-cent Allen key that would allow you to actually make that adjustment a little bit easier. A lot of wheels these days, particularly this kind of price point, include all the hardware that you're likely to need to make adjustments and so forth. So there's really no excuse for not including something that would allow you to make that adjustment more easily. And look, in both cases, again, you have, just like what we saw on the X29, a nice sort of progressive, almost cushion. It almost feels hydraulic, to be honest with you. It isn't, but they've really done a really nice job here. Very, very smooth. And there's enough of a change in resistance as you pull. It's progressive enough that you do get a good sense of where you are in the stroke. So if you're the sort of person that has very precise inputs for something like throttle and brake input, if you're using it that way, then yeah, this is definitely among the best of the best. The analog paddles in both cases here are using Hall effect sensors, so there's no moving mechanical parts or anything like that that can wear and tear or take on dirt and debris over time. The shifter paddles on the FPE V2, as well as the shifters and extended paddles on the Hyper P1, are using little micro switches, as you can see here. These are automotive grade micro switches, which are sealed units, so they shouldn't have any issues with taking on dirt and debris over time. So I don't see that to be a disadvantage over other wheels that use Hall effect sensors, but you may feel differently about that, so it's important to let you know that that is what they're using there. But yeah, overall, just very, very high quality, no flex, nothing like that to speak of. And yeah, absolutely nothing to complain about there, other than just a lack of adjustability, which may or may not be a problem for you. All I can tell you is that it hasn't been a problem for me at all. I haven't needed to adjust these or wish that I could adjust them at any point. So yeah, hasn't been an issue. So just a couple of more quick things to note on the back of both of these wheels. In both cases, we do have a 70mm hole pattern here for mounting pretty much any quick release that you might want. What you're seeing on the back here is a 50mm spacer, which is an optional accessory from GSI. You can see a black one here, as well as a red one on the FPE V2. There are other color options available, purple, gold, you name it. Pretty much it's an option on the website. You guys can check that out for yourselves. Those are an additional expense, of course. There is the option for a 100mm spacer if 50 isn't going to be big enough for you as well. So just make sure you check that the quick release that you're going to be mounting is going to have enough clearance to the shifters. If you've got a really shallow wheelbase that's going to interfere with the shifters on the back here, you may need to have a spacer. Most people, I think, probably aren't going to need these though. So yeah, just don't assume that you need to spend the money. Check that you're going to have enough clearance distance there. And what I would recommend is once you account for the cable rotating past your base and everything, you are going to want to have about 50mm between your quick release and the mounting surface of the wheel. So just be mindful of that as well. And that goes for both wheels here. So you can see internally there is a little tiny cutout in the back here. Now, internally, if you open one of these up, and I'm not going to open these wheels up for this video, there is actually a video on the GSI YouTube channel, which I'll link in the description down below, that shows you how to install shifter paddles, change button caps, and so forth. So if you want to have a look at what the internals are like on these wheels, that's a good option. But there is a little pin header internally that you can unplug the USB connector and then potentially plug something else in there. So you do have a little pass through there if you wanted to run a cable to a internal style quick release, although there's no official support for that. They don't include a little pigtail or anything like that. But you'll notice on both wheels, they have that tiny little notch in the back there, which you could potentially use for achieving that if you wanted to do so. But otherwise, you've got a pretty standard connector on the bottom here, 4-pin connector with a keyway, so you can only plug it in one way, and it does have a nice screw thread on there too, so that it's not going to come loose while you're driving. Now, look, I do really like the system that Cube Controls use these days, the magnetic connector. That does work quite well. It means that if the wheel goes absolutely crazy, it will tear off without causing any damage to anything. So I do personally prefer that. I wasn't a huge fan of it at first because I was concerned that it might come unplugged by accident or, you know, become damaged or something like that. But look, we've been using these wheels on and off now for 3 years with these connectors and never had a single issue. So let us know in the comments down below if you ever have had an issue with them. But yeah, I do think that that is a really clever design and just a little bit less vulnerable to damage. But yeah, this is absolutely fine, and a nice long coiled cable that is included as well. So I think that's everything we need to cover in terms of the basic hardware. Obviously, we'll talk about ergonomics and things in more detail as we get into the driving experience a little bit later on. But what I want to do now is jump on the PC, take you through some of the software configuration options, because they have come a long way on the software side since we originally reviewed the FPE wheel as well. That was one of the big complaints that I had about this wheel, is that while the hardware was absolutely amazing, the software experience was a little bit underwhelming. And yeah, they've made massive improvements there. So let's jump on the PC now and yeah, take a look. Okay, so let's take a look at the improvements that they've made on the software and configuration side. Now, just to give you the deeper context here, when we reviewed the FPE original wheel, it took me about a week to get things running. Back then, there was no integrated profiles in SimHub, so you had to kind of configure everything. You had to find the right profiles for the LEDs and the screens to download. I had all sorts of trouble with Vocore drivers for the display not working properly, glitches and visual artifacts on the screen. And yeah, honestly, it was just a bit of a mess. Now, not everybody had that experience, but that was my honest experience using that wheel. Now, SimHub as a standalone piece of software has come a long way since those days in general. Most new wheels these days will have a profile cooked into SimHub when they release. So all you need to do is download the latest version of SimHub, plug the wheel in, and it'll usually detect that wheel and load a basic default profile for that particular wheel. So most wheels these days have a better experience, including GSI wheels, than what we had years ago when we did that. But just wanted to give you that context here. So first thing you'll notice, if we jump on the GSI website and go to setup, we've got this whole page here dedicated to setup guides. Now, the products don't actually come with printed manuals inside them. There is a QR code inside the box that will take you straight to the setup guide for your wheel. Now, look, the basic instructions are exactly the same between the two wheels. So we're just going to look at the Hyper P1, which has a few additional functions over the FPE V2. But for all intents and purposes, the overall experience of using either one of the wheels is exactly the same. So we're going to click on setup here. And this is just going to take us through everything that we need to do to get the wheel up and running. So you can see here, just as a quick scan through, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you guys can look at this yourselves. You don't need to buy the wheel to access this, but it gives you a quick explanation of the features, mounting the wheelbase, warnings with regards to making sure you're using the right type of screws, etc., etc. Mounting different quick releases, mounting to the wheelbase, software setup, making sure you've got the right software installed, USB connection, and then actually going through and configuring SimHub. So it looks like a lot here, but look, I'm gonna run you through the basics here. It is actually very simple, particularly in comparison to what we used to have to do. Now, they also have a new software package, which is their own thing independent of SimHub. So that is called SimOS. So importantly, SimOS, unlike some of the other wheels that we've reviewed in the past, doesn't give you the full functionality of the wheel outside of SimHub. So you will still need SimHub to do things like controlling the RGB LEDs, the RPM strips, the flags, and of course the dashes on the LCD. What it does allow you to do is make adjustments to things like your bite point and modes and things like that on the wheel. So unlike other brands that do have a completely standalone feature set that can run independently of SimHub, Gomez are still relying on SimHub, at least to some extent, to provide the full functionality of their wheel. So that means if anything ever does happen to SimHub for some reason, you are going to be a little bit out on your own there. I doubt that that's going to happen, but it is something that I think you do need to consider when you compare to other products, which in many cases do have their own integrated system that takes care of everything, should you wish to go down that path. Now, look, most people running most wheels are going to be using SimHub anyway, so I don't really see it as being an advantage unless there is something that happens with SimHub and suddenly it's not supported anymore and then you're on your own. So bringing this up on the screen now, we've got a home screen here, which is basically just advertising. We've got all the devices that are currently connected listed here. So you can actually connect multiple devices at once, but we'll just have a look at the Hyper P1 here. So we can conveniently upgrade our firmware from here. Now we did have a few issues when we had Thrustmaster devices installed or Thrustmaster drivers installed on the PC. What happens is when you go into firmware update mode or DFU mode, flash mode, the Thrustmaster driver kind of grabs that device and won't allow you to install the upgraded firmware. So you may need to uninstall any Thrustmaster drivers just to get the firmware update working. But all you need to do is just click on check for updates, and we can see already on the latest version here, it'll go through the flash process and should all be pretty straightforward. Next down here, we've got the clutch preview. So this is just going to give us a visual representation of the two clutch paddles. You can see down here, we have various different modes. So we've got dual clutch mode, which is the ability to have one paddle as a master and one paddle as a slave. When you release the second hand, it'll go to the bite point, and you can adjust that depending on where the bite point is for the particular car that you're driving. That allows you to get a perfect launch every single time. So just to give you a quick breakdown on exactly how that works, we've got the bite point adjustment here. So you can wind that up or down depending on where the bite point is in the car, and then click apply. And you can see when I pull both levers in here, it's going to go to 100%. When I let go of one, it'll go to my bite point. And then if I slowly release my right hand side one, it's going to go down to 0. So you can understand how that works. You can also choose which side you want to be the master or slave as well. So you can alternate those. There is also the option to make adjustments to the bite point live on the wheel without having to open the software. Now, unfortunately, they haven't, as far as I can tell, integrated this into their dash. Dan Suzuki, who actually works for them as an engineer now and has done for quite some time, has a video, which I'll link down in the description below, to show you how to actually integrate a display on the dash itself to see what your bite point's currently adjusted at. But as it stands out of the box, at least as far as I can tell, all you do is you push down the two buttons here for 1 second. And then if we scroll back up on the screen here, we should see under bite point, there it is. Our left-hand side gives us increments of 10%. Our middle gives us increments of 1%. And then our far right-hand side gives us increments of 0.1%. So we've got an extra fine, a fine, and a coarse adjustment here for our bite point. And then when you're happy with it, you can just press both buttons again, and that gets out of that mode. Now, a lot of other wheels that we have tested here use clever ways of displaying what your bite point is using the LEDs across the top here, which means that you don't have to rely on a dash or opening the software. You can imagine if you're inside the car, it's a little bit awkward to do that because you can't actually see a visual representation unless you create your own dash, but I'm sure at some point they'll integrate that into their own dash. I'm actually surprised they haven't already. Maybe I'm missing something because Dan Suzuki's video was over a year ago now at the time that we're publishing this, but yeah, he does have instructions if you wish to do that. So I'll link that down below for you guys. So that is how the bite point clutch works. Then we also have modes for gas and brake. So that is just giving you a separate access for each hand so you can map them individually. Launch control works very similar to bite point or dual clutch mode, but it just automatically switches the master and slave depending on which hand you release first. Then we've got button mode, which basically makes these operate as a digital button rather than an analog axis, and then no clutch installed, which you would have selected if you didn't have the physical clutches installed on the wheel. Calibration is all done automatically, so there's no calibration built into the software. And then we get down to our encoder logic. So you'll remember before I told you that you can push and hold and then turn to engage a second function. So for example, if you want to change your traction control, you would just turn one dial, for example. If you wanted to change your traction control cut, you could then hold the button down and turn it, and that would give you that second function. So this is where that is all adjusted. So we've got functions for on push and on release. So it says here, GSI encoders offer push, rotate, and push rotate inputs. Pushing it down and rotating will send different button inputs to the game. If the mode is set to on release, the push will only be sent if you did not send the push rotate input. So that's a little bit weird English there. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that is essentially what it does. You've got those modes for both of these encoders. So on push, it'll do the second function and so forth. We've got an adjustment here for encoder pulse width as well. So this is something that I always like to have. If you're finding that you're rotating an encoder, particularly for thumb encoders, and it's not quite responding, it might be doing 2 jumps for every 1 turn, or maybe it's you're having to turn it twice to get 1 move inside the game, you can adjust the pulse width here, and that will just simply adjust how long it's actually pulsing that command for in either direction. So the encoders do only operate as rotary encoders, not multi-position switches, unlike some other wheels. But between all of those different modes and so forth, you should be able to cover most of the things that you want. And because we don't have individually labeled positions on the rotary encoders, it kind of makes sense that they do it that way. But again, some other wheels do have additional functionality there. And I would definitely say that some other wheels have better functionality or better integration in terms of things like the bike point adjustment, particularly the Spectra XR and the Myaris 2 wheels. Definitely would recommend have a look at the reviews of both of those wheels and compare them to what you're seeing here to get a better understanding of exactly what I'm talking about. We then also have a tab here for wheel tester. This is quite simply just allowing you to push each individual button and see that it is actually responding inside the software, so you can see if you've got any faulty buttons or anything like that. So look, the software is a little bit primitive at this point, but still, you know, at least it's something. It's a lot better than what we've had in the past. We then also just have a settings tab here as well, which allows us to change different themes. We can switch to a dark mode as well if we want to, which is cool. A developer mode, which most of you guys aren't going to need to touch. And then you can choose whether you want to have stable updates or beta updates for things like firmware. And then also a third-party driver mitigation thing here. This is related to what we were talking about before with the Thrustmaster driver, although I did have that problem, as I was saying, and this didn't actually work for me. I did have to uninstall the Thrustmaster driver to get everything working. And then we've got a couple of things here for troubleshooting as well. These are the same as the tips that you'll find on their website. So if you're experiencing common problems like disconnects, garbled screens, or lack of communication or broken communication, there's some tips here for how to do all that kind of stuff and so forth. So good that they have these tool tips here. And again, as I mentioned before, the Discord community is really good. There's a lot of support there and a lot of very experienced people. So that is a quick run through of the GSI SimOS side of things. So we'll close that off quickly now. So if we go back to the GSI website and go to setup, we've got a button here for display dashes. So we can download GSI's own dashes, which I believe are developed by Lovely Dashboard, or you can just run your own dashboard. I always run Lovely Dashboard on pretty much every wheel that I have these days because, in my opinion, at least, it is just the superior software. Then we also have LED profiles, which are available here as well to download. So we can download these and then just load them into SimHub. Now, as I said before, there are third-party profiles available from guys like Daniel Newman Racing. So if you want to experiment further or create your own profiles, you can, of course, do all that through SimHub. But at least now they have some clearly defined profiles here that you can download, get up and running, and not have all the problems that we had years ago with the experience with the FPE wheels. So yeah, definitely some significant improvements there. So let's just quickly open up SimHub 2 and we'll go to the devices screen. And you can see here we've got our GSI Hyper P1 selected. If we didn't have that wheel already installed, all we would need to do is just go add new device, and we're going to get a prompt here that allows us to select the wheel that's connected or find it in the drop-down menu and then get up and running. So you're not having to sort of scramble for profiles like we had to in the past. So you can configure here what you want to have as your default dashboard, the idle behavior and so forth. Pretty much exactly the same as any other wheel. There's no fancy plugins or anything like that in here like we have for the Solpec wheel, for example, but you can load different dashboards here. You can load different profiles for your buttons or telemetry LEDs here as well. And as I was describing before, you can have the buttons respond to what you're doing. You can have the buttons light up as a spotter or track status, for example. You've got your flag LEDs and your RPM strips here as well. And the default profiles work absolutely fine in all the sims that I tested with. Didn't have any issues with mismatched RPMs or anything like that. And yeah, so customization wise, you can do pretty much anything you want here. The sky's the limit in terms of customization, but there are some decent profiles available too. And I think that's everything you need to know, at least at a top level in terms of the software integration. So let's get into the driving experience now. So what are the Hyper P1 and FPE V2 wheels like to drive with? So I spent quite a lot of time with both of these wheels. I actually ended up spending even more time with FPE V2 simply because that ended up being the wheel that I chose to drive with out of all the other wheels that we have in our collection for the majority of the last couple of months. You guys would have seen a lot of my race videos have included this wheel. And so you might be wondering, why do I prefer this wheel over this wheel, even though this is the more expensive of the two? And quite simply, I prefer the way this one looks subjectively. I prefer the ergonomics of this and just the kind of rounded edges a little bit more. You're gripping the wheel a little bit higher up as opposed to gripping from the bottom on this one as well, which just suits a wider variety of driving. Given that I'm driving primarily sort of, you know, your GT4, GT3 style cars, I'm not spending a lot of time driving F1 prototypes and things like that. If I was, then I would probably lean more towards the Hyper P1. And look, honestly, I just don't really need the additional functions that we have on here, being the third encoder, the additional thumb wheels, and the additional paddles at the top here. Now you can, of course, option to not have those additional paddles on the top, which will bring the price down a little bit, of course, but it is still going to be more expensive than what you have with the FPE V2. And look, I'm interested to hear from you guys in the comments down below. What are your thoughts, you know, subjectively on the looks between the two of them? Do you prefer the more sort of square design of the Hyper P1, or do you prefer the more curvy, rounded design of the FPE V2? But look, I mean, all of that is purely just down to subjective preference. The reality is both wheels are absolutely fantastic. Both do provide an absolutely fantastic driving experience as well. I would say that when you get into the software side of things, they are a little bit lacking in comparison to some of the other wheels that we've tested over the years, particularly the Rexing RS V2 and the Solpex Spectra XR. I would say those do offer more functionality in terms of the UI, adjustments, menus, and things like that. But look, having said that, did I actually miss any of that stuff at any point when I was using this wheel for a couple of months? No, I didn't. This does everything that I need it to do for the types of cars that I'm driving. And, you know, I often find that some of those more complex wheels can be quite convoluted and, you know, a little bit sort of all over the place to drive with, particularly if you're jumping in and out of lots of different cars regularly. I think, like what I said in the reviews of those two wheels, particularly the Rexing RS V2, well, if you have one car that you're really focusing on and you can really dial in all those menus and all those options to really suit that car and just nail that, then yeah, I can certainly see the value in something like that. But for somebody that's jumping and changing between cars all the time, I actually prefer something that's a little bit more simple for those reasons. But again, you know, that is a very subjective thing. You might feel completely different about that. But look, what I can say is that in terms of nailing all of the fundamentals, very similar to my comments on the X29 wheel. You know, the shifters, the clutch paddles, the buttons, the feeling of everything, the touch points, the switch gear, everything is just, you know, and I hate to use the word perfect because it doesn't allow any room for improvement. But yeah, for me, they've really absolutely nailed it. It is as close to perfection as I've ever seen in terms of the feeling, all of those buttons. And that's, you know, with or without gloves as well across both of these wheels. So right now, if I had to choose a wheel with a screen in it for my personal rig, as you guys have seen, it would be the FPE V2. You may feel differently, but yeah, for the things that I personally need, it is absolutely spot on. A couple of other things that I noticed just in the driving experience is the ergonomics across both wheels, just being able to reach all of those buttons very comfortably, having the thumb encoders in nice reachable places, you know, having the buttons responding to button presses. It's just so clean and tidy. Look, I mean, in terms of the dash integration, GSI's dashes, which I believe are developed by Lovely Racing anyway, are very nice. Certainly not a reason to buy these wheels over any other wheel, because you could just download them and run them on any other wheel anyway, or just run Lovely Dashboard, which works on pretty much everything these days. And look, I mean, it's so great to see companies like Lovely Dashboard, Daniel Newman Racing, for example, expanding and, you know, able to be financially sustainable, so they are able to offer their services and really improve a lot of these products, as we were discussing earlier on, you know, in these kinds of wheels that are relying on third parties to an extent, at least, to provide their full functionality. But yeah, I mean, in both cases, I think they've absolutely knocked it out of the park, as you would expect from GSI, and as you would definitely expect at this kind of price point. Beyond that, honestly, it's just going to come down to what is more important to you. I mean, you can get most of this same functionality in wheels that cost a lot less than this. You know, if you want to look at something like the Moser FSR V2 or something like that, for example, but you're just not getting anywhere near the same kind of experience in terms of the quality of the feel. And, you know, this is just something that looks, but in both cases, something that just looks beautiful on the rig. And, you know, there's value in that for people as well. So, yeah, a lot of it is down to pure subjectivity, but in terms of the objective stuff, yeah, there really isn't a whole lot to complain about in either instance. Really, the only complaints that I have are just on the software side of things, with not being quite as advanced as some of the other wheels that we've looked at around this kind of price point or cheaper. So really hope that today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. If you are wanting to pick up either of these wheels or any other sim racing gear, head over to boostedmedia.net for all the latest discount codes and our affiliate links, which is an awesome way, as I said before, of helping support our channel at no additional cost, and even potentially saving yourself a little bit of cash in the process. As I said before, we do have a 5% discount code for the Gomez wheels if you decide you want to go down that path, and plenty of other discount codes for the other products that we've looked at in today's video as well. And before you click off, leave a comment down below. Let me know which one of these two wheels you would choose if you had the choice, or would you choose something else, one of the other wheels that we've looked at in today's video, or something else completely that we haven't looked at before. Always on the lookout for new and innovative things. So yeah, let us know in the comments down below. But above all, thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.